Wake up, Lo-Fi Nation. It's a very special Wednesday. And welcome everyone to the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pickering. That's right. Lo-Fi as in low fidelity, low quality, in your face, messy as can be global news show. And here with us to talk about that famous question, a very special guest. I'm so happy to have with me one of Lo-Fi Poli Sci's very own, a friend of all of ours, as well as our first co-host of the show, Shay Meredith, JD candidate at the University of Illinois College of Law. Shay, thank you so much for coming in with us today. How are you?
Yes, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I'm Shay Meredith. I graduated from Tulane in May of 2020. I'm currently a first-year law student at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So out in the middle of the cornfields in Illinois, not the fun Chicago area. But I was a student of Dr. Pickering's back in the day, way back a long time ago, about a year and a half, 2 years now. And I know I promised I wouldn't talk you up too much, but I do want to say I really credit Professor Pickering a great deal for helping me find my passion for political science. So, yeah. So thank you for that. And thank you for having me.
Wow, you are very welcome. Thank you for coming on. It's great to be able to talk to you again after such a long time. And to see where
Yes.
you are and, to see what you are doing as far as keeping up with what's going on in the world. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. So what are we talking about today, and a little background to what we're talking about?
Yeah. So today we're going to be kind of talking about the situation that's going on with Alexei Navalny in Russia. So just a little background on kind of Russia's political outlook at the moment. Russia is a one-party dominant authoritarian regime. It's got little sprinkles of opposition parties holding seats in their parliament, which is called the Duma. And actually, the largest opposition party to United Russia, which is the main party there, is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which everyone thinks that kind of went out of style, so to speak, in 1991, 1992, but still around.
I
They
think that
also
is
have
lovely. That the Communist Party is Putin's biggest challenge in Russia. That's
right.
great.
As a former member of a communist party himself, it's pretty interesting. So yeah, they have some of these registered parties that hold seats in the Duma, and they also have some unregistered parties that serve some sort of extra normal like political avenues, opposing role to the dominant United Russian Party, which is led by Vladimir Putin, who's the president. And one of these unregistered parties is Russia the Future, which is led by none other than Alexia Navalny, who we are going to be diving into today.
Yes, this is excellent and very interesting for me in particular, and for everyone that listens to Lo-Fi Poli Sci, because Navalny, he is someone we have talked quite a bit about. We talked about him being poisoned months ago, him going to Germany. We talked about him being arrested the moment he got back into Russia. We've talked about protests for his release. But we really don't know a whole lot about him as an individual. So what do you got for us? Who is this Navalny guy, really?
Yeah, so Alexei Navalny, he was born the 4th of June, 1976. So he's a pretty young guy, pretty fresh face, as far as, politics goes, quite a bit younger than Vladimir Putin himself. So Navalny actually has a law degree from I believe it's the People's Friendship University of Russia. So he's a fellow, well, I'm not a lawyer yet, but he is a fellow legal scholar, shall we say. So Alexei Navalny, he is currently the leader of the Russia of the Future Party, which is that unregistered party that I mentioned before. And he basically has been around in politics for a while. He's pretty much always held some sort of opposition position to the United Russia Party, or basically whatever Putin is doing, Putin and the oligarchs, I should say. So originally he was in the Russian United Democratic Party. It was called Yabloko, which essentially was kind of like a nationalist party. Every party that he's been involved in has been somewhat nationalist, which I think is something that also is not really reported a lot on. That's kind of been his main ongoing theme of his political views is he is definitely a Russian nationalist. So that is kind of a short introduction to where he's coming from. He's been around in the political scene for about 20 years at this point. Bounced
So
around between, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
let me ask you about this. So
Sure.
for a lot of people, when we say nationalist, and in this case, you're saying Russian nationalist. So
Mhm.
Putin himself is a Russian nationalist. He's very Russia first. He's very about
Sure.
creating this sense of a great country, a great nation, and a great Russian people. And
Absolutely.
many times in democratic countries, that's kind of painted in a very negative connotation. Are you saying that Navalny himself is similar to Putin in those regards?
Yes, and I think this is actually reflective of something that's, uh, taking a look at a place like Russia from a Western lens. It's something that's hard for us to grasp, right? Is this concept of, people in the country? It's a popular idea. Russian nationalism is extremely popular, and a lot of people just see that as kind of par for the course and a necessary element to have in your political ideology if you're trying to get following in Russia, because that's just a broad based belief that people hold. And I
So
would
it's a
say,
cultural belief, would you say?
yeah, I would say that's definitely part of it. I think a lot of it is very, I mean, Navalny is the exact same as Putin in the same sense of, Russia first. Navalny has a history of some hostile comments and hostile policy positions towards immigration, and also towards people within Russia who aren't of the Russian ethnicity, because as people are probably aware, Russia is the biggest country on the planet, not by population, of course, but just land area. And also, there are many, many, many different ethnic groups, language groups, cultural groups. And um, the Russian ethnic group is the one that you typically are going to be seeing in Moscow. Like Navalny is a member of that ethnic group, so is Putin. But Navalny has made some comments towards Chechen people, who that's in the region of Chechnya within Russia, and also towards Georgians. So he has some history that is a little bit problematic when it comes to immigration. Problematic from the view of like liberal Western political kind of spectacle, I would say.
Right, right. And I think you bring up a great point, mentioning the Russian ethnicity and Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I think you're right. The geographic size of Russia, you look at it on a map and you realize the vast majority of it's in Asia. There has to be a multitude of different ethnic groups there. But when you
Mhm.
look on Russian television and Russian interviews and on the internet, all you see is white ethnic Russians.
Right.
And
And that's, oh, sure, go ahead.
no,
Sorry.
no, please, you go ahead.
Yeah, so that's definitely a theme that Putin has kind of perpetuated, and also Navalny subscribes to himself. And this is kind of, I mean, also most of the time when you see leaders within Russia, obviously Putin most notably calling for the annexation of Crimea or some other region in Eastern Europe, they're usually targeting areas that are heavily populated by ethnic Russians rather than somewhere like Kazakhstan or like further out east. They're not really worried about that. They're worried about the regions that are uh, predominantly ethnic Russian, or there are ethnic Russian inhabitants of the regions.
Right. This is something that's extremely always fascinated me, just about Russian politics and how Russian politics are portrayed at the international level, and how we as individuals who live in a Western democracy, the images that we see of Russia, and the idea that is painted for us, but it's very much a picture that is painted for us deliberately. And it's deliberately painted that way to erase everything that is further east in Russia and different ethnicities. And so the impression that I'm getting from you is that Navalny very much supports this picture to the international stage. Would you say so?
I would definitely agree with that. And I think this kind of ties back into the, Russian first ideology, which is something that Putin kind of started, but Navalny has always perpetuated. It's this idea of Ruski Mir, which means Russian world, and trying to bring in like Belarusian and Ukrainian people. And Navalny's actually made comments in the past about how he believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. And he's kind of walked that back in the past, or more recently, he's walked those comments back and said Ukraine has every right to be autonomous. But he has not been extremely condemned, or he hasn't extremely condemned Putin's stances towards Crimea, and just a lot of those aggressive kind of pro-Russian, pro-ethnic Russian policies that Putin's been pushing.
Well, then let me ask you. You mentioned Belarus, and for
Mhm.
individuals who aren't aware of Crimea, Crimea was a part of Ukraine, but Russia has annexed it. So, well, two questions to you. I'll just do one at a time, though.
Sure.
What do you think? Do you feel Navalny is pro Russia annexing Crimea?
He initially supported the annexation of Crimea. So he has kind of walked back a lot of his more nationalist positions in recent years. And a lot of that, I have kind of seen murmurs online that people think it's because he has noticed over the past couple of years, he's gotten more attention from the West. And the West has kind of propped him up as the most prominent opposition leader in Russia to Putin. And so as he's gotten that attention, he's shifted some of his perspectives, and he has come out against the annexation of Crimea. And there's hope that if he were actually in power, he would help return Crimea to Ukraine. But I mean, he hasn't been extremely explicit about that up to this point. In fact, I think he still may hold the view that that area would most likely, if a new referendum were held, would probably still vote to remain in Russia, which he he may not be wrong in that belief. And he said that they should hold a more fair referendum to actually gauge the real interest of people in that region of being annexed by Russia. But I think that he still would probably support the annexation if the referendum came out in favor of that.
Gotcha, gotcha. And then, so I'll go off of what you said. So, since he's realized he's gotten more Western attention, and because of that, he's evolved some of his stances politically. Wouldn't that kind of add credence to the idea, a very Russian and united Russia and Putin idea that Navalny is backed and supported by Western powers? There are some theories within Russia that Navalny is just a Western democratic puppet, made to be a force against Putin.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a chicken and the egg type of thing. It it's hard to say whether he has changed his perspective based on seeing the attention that he's getting from the West and getting support from some larger allies, the US, UK. But it's also entirely possible that as he's traveled abroad and started to get more attention, he's actually shifted his views because he has a change of heart. He actually was a visiting student at Yale, I think it was in 2010. So he has experience traveling in the West. He's obviously spent plenty of time in Germany for uh, better or worse. So he has experienced more of the West and met with Western leaders and gotten support from the West. But it's hard to say if that has made him kind of cynically change his perspective or if he has just had a change of heart as for how he sees Russia's role in the international sphere and domestically.
No, I think you're right. I think it is highly possible. I won't necessarily say probable because, like you said, it's something that we just can't be sure of. But of
Sure.
course, people as individuals, they can change, they can evolve, their views can evolve. And like you said, born in 1976, he's still rather young, and as experience increases around the world and the individuals and people that you interact with change, you as a person do change. So I think, yeah, you're right. It is hard to tell.
Of
But
course.
let's go ahead and bring all of this back around. So now we have some background of who he actually is.
Mhm.
What's the most recent things that we have heard about what's going on in Russia and the protest and everything like this?
Sure. So there are massive protests going on in some of the major population hubs in Russia at the moment. There are protests that are opposing the criminal charges that were pressed against Navalny. And he actually was sentenced to 2.5 years in a labor, what do they call it? A labor convent or a labor, I don't want to say labor camp because that sounds,
A labor
uh,
colony?
yes, a labor colony, that would be the term. Yes. So he was sentenced to 2.5 years in a labor colony. And there have been massive protests and uprisings opposing his sentence and in support of him. Um, but a lot of those protests are getting cracked down on pretty heavily. There actually was a video that was leaked today by Russian authorities that they believe that it was leaked in order to kind of deter future protesters. And it was a prominent Russian journalist who has supported opposition movements, opposition to Putin and the United Russia Party in the past. And they had him, these Russian security forces had him kneeling down. Just, it was a pretty horrifying video. So it kind of is used as it's a scare tactic to prevent future prominent figures from going out and protesting and saying this is what will happen. So yeah, the protests are pretty massive. They're getting also massively cracked down upon, and that's kind of what's going on. That just happened today, that video leaking.
Yeah, and for our listeners, so so we're recording this on Saturday, February 13th, and we're going to release this on Wednesday, February 18th. So from the time Shay's talking about and the release of that video to when you hear this will be 5 days. So there could be more things developed since this video drops. And I think you're right. Protests are massive, but so is the repression that is going on. And also, I think geopolitics is an important thing. There is a long-standing theme that you do not invade Russia during Russian winter. And
Absolutely not.
Russian winter also is likely hindering this protest movement as well from being as big as it would be. Um, but I got two questions to close out for you, Shay. All right, so our
Let's
first
hear him.
one, does Navalny actually have a chance to change Russia, or to even get out of jail in less than 2.5 years?
It's hard to say. I think the international coverage of his poisonings and arrests and the massive protests in reaction to all of that would seem to suggest that there's a chance of, maybe international pressure causing Putin to either release him or sentence him to less time or less harsh conditions. But I think this is it may or may not be false hope, because in the past there has been international attention on atrocities that Putin's committed. In the past he's poisoned other opposition figures with Novichok, which is the radioactive element that he poisoned Navalny with twice now, and those also got massive media attention, and nothing really came about. And so it's good to see that people are recognizing that something massive is happening, but I'm not sure that this will actually pan out to anything changing.
Those are some really good points. And on average, I would tend to agree with you, unless we see some other linchpin be pulled. Like I like to say, massive people's power movements, they're powerful. But usually, even when all the variables are lined up for change to take place, usually there needs to be at least one linchpin pulled before all the dominoes can actually fall. And it's a matter of, is this that one linchpin, or is there still something else that needs to take place? But even if that happens, okay. Let's say Navalny gets out of jail and somehow President Putin is ousted and Navalny leads the country. Will that really be the Russia that Western democracies expect or even want?
Again, it's hard to know for sure. And I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier of how he's shifted his political and social views so much in the last 10 years. Because with a lot of Western, liberal democracies, we're fairly opposed to nationalism. And as someone who has espoused pretty heavily Russian nationalist views in the past, I think it's not entirely clear that he would actually be this pro-Western reformer. He's made comments that do reflect a real change of heart. He's supported same-sex marriage in Russia. He's definitely looking for warmer relations with the West. Him going to Germany after being poisoned is pretty heavy evidence of his friendlier relations with EU countries. But I think it's also important to note that his party, Russia of the Future, has far fewer documented members than the Communist Party, the second most popular political party in Russia after Putin's United Russia Party. So it's difficult to say that if he were leading the country that he would actually have broad support even within the country, since it's not entirely clear that Russians actually want to be a Western liberal democracy. And so the internal tensions may outweigh what Western democracies actually want Russia to look like and the role that Russia plays in that sphere.
You just made me think of something. Russia changes. President Putin is ousted. His political party, United Russia, falls. And Russians go and have a democratic election, and the Communist Party wins because they have the biggest second party.
Right.
I just imagine that democracy could theoretically elect a communist party to lead a democracy. That's amazing. That's Russia. What else can we say?
Something we can't even fathom here, right?
Right.
We never think of that. Very Russia.
Well, Shay, this has been simply spectacular. Thank you so much for coming on and co-hosting with me and really providing me and all of us with a new perspective of what's going down with Navalny and who he is and some of the things that we don't regularly know about. And please come back to us soon because you are Lofi Poli Sci. Shay, would you definitely please do the honor of taking us out for the day?
I would be honored to do so. And that's a brief snapshot of what's going on in the world today. Stay tuned for tomorrow's episode of Lo-Fi Global News. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, wash those hands, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. Meredith and Pickering signing off.